The 2022 Ohio Beef Cattle Feeding School was hosted simultaneously in both Sandusky and Mercer Counties by the Ohio State University Extension on February the 8th. The focus of this year's school was supply chain concerns for both fed cattle and also the feedstuffs they are finished with. OSU Extension Beef Specialist Dr. Steve Boyles led off the evening with a look at feed costs and strategies for reducing those costs while maintaining performance. Stan Smith followed with a brief look at the updated OSU Fed Cattle Beef Budgeting spreadsheets. The program concluded with Dr. Lyda Garcia's discussion regarding the beef packing industry with regards to capacity and supply chain disruptions. This is that beef school program in its entirety.
And I was given this title of High Grain Prices in Cattle Feeding, and I asked some people about this to give me some help. One of the things, I was with a working group in earlier, you see the date there, 119, and one of the people in the working group was a feed yard owner in Nebraska, and the capacity of the yard is about 12,000 head. And I started asking him, what are you doing with regards to this, high priced feed? And he says, well, I'm trying to use a lot of prayer, but also I'm focusing on efficiency. And even I talked to a nutritionist out in Iowa, and that was the recommendation there as well. Focus on those little things. I'm sorry to tell you, I don't know of a wonder feed tonight that is under $40 a ton that'll match corn. So we're going to focus on some of the management practices that we can do to eke out that efficiency of everything we do. Well, one thing is certainly, this is kind of the front end. I know you already got cattle on feed, but still that veterinary client-patient relationship. This is some data from out of Texas, and these are producers just like you that were feeding out steers. It was a steer test. They were seeing what their cattle, how they performed, how the genetics were. And you look down through there, if something got pulled, it was in the sick group. They didn't have to pull them, it was healthy. And there you can scroll down and see the return. So cattle that were in the same pen or the same feed yard, there was a difference in profitability. Nutrition was the same, management was the same. Now you look at those numbers on choice, healthy cattle, 40% choice. Keep in mind, this is Texas, and they might be thrilled with 40% choice. Choice cattle for the nation, I think, come out of the Corn Belt, and Ohio is part of that. But in relative terms, cattle that get sick, there's a challenge to look at a profit in those cattle, low price feed or high price feed. Another place I looked was what are professional nutritionists, I'm a professional, I guess, but people that, that's their business. That's all they do, being consulting nutritionists. And looking at what they did, these people created the study, but they did a survey of those sorts of nutritionists that are working with yards and what they're doing as far as management goes with cattle feeding. One of the things they said to focus on was bunk management. All those different people, in that we want to have low levels of acidosis. We don't want to have feed waste, and we want to improve feed efficiency. And one of the ways to do that is with bunk management. I'm not sure we're going to do a whole lot of testing feed after it's mixed, but that's what some of those professional feed yards are doing, those professional consultants. They have the analysis of the feeds, but then they test it, that ration that is mixed. Is it mixed properly? Is that something we might consider? Maybe, perhaps, but looking at the efficiency that way. Well, this is Robbie Pritchard out of South Dakota. I give him credit. He really created this about almost 30 years ago. He's just now recently retired. But that's the bunk scoring system he created. The 0 is no feed remaining in the bunk, half a scattered feed present, then 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, here's some pictures of that. A bunk score of 0, and even that wetness, I'm not sure I'm totally comfortable with 0. Even within his system, he calls it 0 minus, 0, and 0 plus. Those wet spots on that one slide, that's cattle licking. That might be a little bit more slick than I want. I don't want to see wet spots, because they're licking. I don't want them to be that hungry. But maybe that scattered of 1, 1, 2 there is something that we might be looking for as far as scoring bunks. And you can keep on going up to a 2. There you start seeing cat or feed being left in the bunk. Now, if it's wet feed, it's going to have to be cleaned out. And even dry feed. After I was just at a yard today, they had some feed in that was 4 days old. Well, the cattle aren't going to eat that. So they really do need to improve use a bunk scoring system and improve how they're managing the feed. These are just additional pictures of that, a 0, half, 1, and a 3 over there that you hadn't seen. There's still quite a bit of feed in there. You can see that the mounds of feed, the cattle have touched that, but we're really not looking for that much feed left in the bunk. So it's kind of that, an individual here talked about a slick bunk system is what we're looking for to reduce feed wastage. And one of the things you do if you're bunk scoring is you don't do things immediately. You probably look at what happened the previous 4 days. Are they continually being that very negative 0 minus? We probably need to really start moving up feed. And in general, about a 10% move is enough to move cattle up. You don't want to go to 30% more because they can't handle that much feed quickly. So looking at those bunk calls, so it's looking at that 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're looking at the bunks, but the other thing you do is look at the cattle. My basic rule is 25, 50, 25. You want the cattle, what's their behavior behind the bunk? And here's an example of that. So yes, you're scoring the bunks 1, 2, 3, 4, or 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but this is an example of looking at cattle and their behavior. Here's the feed truck quite a distance away from this particular pen of cattle. Dr. Garcia will recognize this when she and I were working in Mexico. But anyway, the feed bunk or the feed truck is quite a distance away. And as the feed truck gets closer, these cattle are moving up to the bunk, looking to consume some feed. And you can look at the back of the pen. They're starting to move cattle up to the front, but not everybody, not everybody. So there, the truck is passed. There's cattle there that are eating. There's some cattle that got up and they're standing there kind of waiting to see, maybe I'll get something to eat. But still further back in the pen, there's cattle that haven't moved up at all. And there's an example. This is finally the truck is completely left. There's cattle at the bunk. There's cattle back in the shade area, not coming to the bunk. They ate. They're not starving. It's okay. So that 25, 50, 25 is also an indication of the bunk scoring system. Well, this is a example of somebody that knows what they're doing. And this is in a university setting, but somebody that was calling bunks and knew how to do it. Gradually going up on feed. You see that they plateaued, then they were ready to go up a little bit. But look how level that is in using that bunk scoring system. These were students in the class who were doing the bunk scoring. All over the board. The cattle were going up and down with intake. The result of something like this is prescription, or that's bunk scoring versus almost like guessing. The one thing to look at, look at average daily gain. No difference there. Why are we doing all this bunk scoring and yet we're not improving gain? But look at feed efficiency. 6.15 versus 6.9. Over a number of cattle and over a number of days, that can make a difference in feed efficiency. So with high price feed, we're wasting less of it. Some other things at a yard today, we were talking about reducing having to clean out feed if the cattle are pooping in it, to be honest. I personally like a little step next to the feed bunk, and that's about their hind feet. Cattle don't like to stand higher on their hind feet. So having a little bit of a lip there, the cattle will stand there with their front feet on it. Be honest, I don't care about that. I don't want them defecating in the feed bunk. And you can think about that also around a waterer. Are you getting animals that are defecating in the water? Then you might think about a little step. And that way they're not inclined to put their hind end next to the water trough. The other picture over there, and pardon me trying to use digital, is a self-feeder. I run into situations where somebody says the cattle are really doing well, but then they just seem to stall out. And I don't think it's acidosis, I think it's bunk space. If you have a self-feeder, don't put it up right next to the fence. In this diagram, the vertical line is the fence. And so a tractor would come along on the outside and dump feed in the self-feeder, which is that green rectangle. I've put in a little bit of space of, say, a couple feet away from the outside or the outside fence. Think about these cattle as they get bigger, their shoulders are getting bigger. So there was enough bunk space when they were calves, maybe even as that approached the yearlings. But what about when they're finishing? That narrow space between the self-feeder and the fence is starting to limit bunk space. So you think about in a self-feeder about 4 to 5 inches, just bunk space, maybe about a 3-inch level of letting grain come in there. That is critical. So to help maintain that bunk space, so we can still feed the cattle from outside, but think about a little bit of space, a foot or two away from that exterior fence. Also, just thinking about the curtain or the lip so that water can drain away. Think about mud. We want these cattle to nibble, just come up whenever they want and nibble on feed. Whereas if the conditions in the pen are not ideal and they have to work to get to the bunk, they're going to gulp down feed whenever they can. So we want them to have easy access to the bunk. And always try to keep clean water clean. I've got a box up there below roof without gutters. There's going to be water come down on the pen. So maybe water coming off a roof, if it can be moved, not allowed to get to the pen, even in a concrete pen, that just reduces moisture around the pen. Obviously, you can see this is a severe mud problem. What is the impact of mud? And I assume we're not all feeding on dirt, and I won't stay here long, but look, if the pen conditions aren't very good, this is reduction in gain, but that's also reduction in efficiency. If you've ever had to tromp through deep mud, the amount of energy you have to expend to move around. So deep mud needs to be handled or addressed. If you happen to have a dirt lot, you just move off the manure soil layer, not try to get down to complete dry. Also, that manure soil layer above the bulldozer is more compact. That also reduces soil, groundwater contamination. Sometimes in a dirt lot, what I like to do is take a pen, ballpoint pen, and just push it down into that lot to the point where it stands up, but I can't press it without a lot of pressure. I don't want to go any deeper than that when scraping in a dirt lot. Another place to look at efficiency are birds. Yes, birds. European starlings, those little darlings, were first introduced in the 1800s in New York City. And the reasoning was they wanted all the birds that were noted in Shakespeare's plays. And of course, you can look out in Ohio at certain times of the year and see Shakespeare's legacy to us. In the winter months and cold days, they can eat a lot of feed. They consume over 2 pounds of feed in a 30-day period. And you think about all those starlings that are out there, they've found their behavior. They'll eat steam flake corn. They like whole corn, rolled corn, cracked corn. They're really not wild about soybean pellets. But that doesn't solve the problem. A nutritionist or you have put together a diet that's supposed to meet their requirements, and you're sharing energy with birds that are out there. Research in this study observed that birds arrive at the feedlot at approximately 8 a.m. and return to roost at 4 p.m. you may be forced, if you're having a problem like this, to, well, I'm not saying raise the white flag, but alter when you're feeding your cattle. So you might have to look out there and see when the birds are arriving and then determine, are you going to try to feed after or before the birds arrive? You can also contact the U.S. Wildlife Service, and they'll try to work with you on options in handling that. Now, they do have some toxicants that they can use on starlings, but it's only approved for those people, Wildlife Service officers, to use. So you might look at options like that, as those pictures you see there of starlings in a feed yard. Getting into some feed, Dr. Steve Lurch, who's retired from Ohio State University, but give him credit for numerous research studies in looking at whole-shelled corn. In his work, he found that certainly feeding whole corn eliminates processing cost. And he said the improvements in performance from rolling or cracking corn grain are often not sufficient to offset a 5 or 10% processing cost. So this is where you're going to have to start thinking about, well, do I have to take it to town to get it processed, what the cost is? And he said that whole corn might be considered in specific applications, such as in starter rations, limit feeding situation when forage is less than, say, 5% of the diet, even less than 20% of the diet. But these are his statements at a National Grain Processing Symposium. So he went on to further state, processing appears to have some value for dry shelled corn when you have more than 20% roughage. So we're starting to move into, well, higher roughage diet, certainly a growing ration, backgrounding ration, definitely think about processing. If corn is a particularly dry, that would probably be in a drought year. Certainly it should be considered. Even when corn is processed, getting into my own preferences, I probably preferred roll corn compared to ground corn. The top picture is rollers and the bottom is a hammer mill. If you look at those things hanging from the bigger wheel at the bottom, those are big, basically hammers. That's what they are called. Hammer milled grain, for probably swine, it breaks up the corn kernel a lot more. But my contention is, if corn looks like pig feed, we're making it too fine. Corn only needs to be broken up into 3 to 5 pieces. And maybe removing the screen on that hammer mill and do some experiment that way and see what it looks like. So it's more coarsely broken up. People have looked at mixing grains, different rates of fermentation. I've got a question mark there. I've seen some studies where mixing high moisture corn with dry corn, maybe you get some improvement in efficiency, but to be honest, I've seen other studies doing the same thing and they didn't see anything different. The one place, and we don't raise grain sorghum. There's been some improvement with grain sorghum, which is very slowly fermented with something that's more rapidly fermented like high moisture corn. But with the different corn processes we have, it's still a question mark for me. I've seen, opposing studies. This is given the high price of corn, do we look at higher roughage diets? This is just looking at some diets. This is a high roughage diet that's 30% and a high energy diet that's only 10% roughage. Those are you can look down through there, the amount of rolled corn, the amount of hay, the amount of distillers grains, and the route of a mineral pack. And the biggest difference was that grain and hay. Are we going to make any money by adding roughage to the system? Not really. If you look at these numbers, you're welcome to look at feed efficiency and average daily gain. There's some differences there, but this is going to lead into maybe some things that Stan Smith is going to talk about in budgets. The cattle that are in a higher roughage diet took a longer time to get there. So there's that additional days on feed of 64 days, additional yardage for electricity, paying for water, gas, those other things. So a higher roughage diet may not be an option for us here. And this is with beef steers. And this is the same thing done with Holstein steers. Certainly over here in the western part of the state, I'm aware we certainly have some Holstein feeders. Numbers are slightly different, but the same thing happens. The higher roughage diet added to more days on feed, and that may negate any sort of perceived advantage to providing additional roughage. So it's an economic question. Well, another option maybe we look at is putting the early pounds on out in the country. I remember asking when we had the economist do a presentation, I was curious of what we can do with, do we own these cattle as stockers or as backgrounders? And that's an option, although that's a separate enterprise. But we don't really control those cattle for the entire feeding period. And so it's so important that enterprise, be it stocker cattle, and I say I own those stocker cattle, what did I have to pay for them? And then what are they worth? Even though I'm putting them in my feed yard, what are they worth when they come off grass? So it almost you have to think about that. Feeding cattle out in the country, be it backgrounding or stocker, is two different enterprises, and you have to see if it makes money there or loses money for you. Well, I kept on asking people about this, and I asked a nutritionist out of Minnesota about what he thought about this, and he said, consider the use of alternative feeds such as corn gluten feed, distillers byproducts, small grains, probably more of an option in Minnesota. And, look, are there alternative feeds that we can optimize feed use? And admittedly, with small grains, be it wheat, might be an example here, you need to process it. I had somebody call me about some seed grain and they wanted to feed it. And I said, well, yeah, but you probably should process it to get any use out of it. At least the individual, he wanted to feed it just to get rid of it. And I said, well, yeah, maybe it works as a roughage, won't hurt the cattle, but we can have discussions or debates about corn, but wheat, barley, that sort of thing probably needs to be processed. Briefly about some of those feeds that were mentioned, distillers grains with solubles. If you're going to think about feeding distillers grains, understand it varies from plant to plant. I have book values on corn. I'm fairly confident in using those. However, different plants have different processes, so it can be more variable. So with distillers grain, what you're doing is taking all the carbohydrate out and you're leaving the variability that was in there. Corn has variability. If you take all the carbohydrate out of corn, you're left with more variability. So that's what that bell curve means. Soybean meal, less variability. Doesn't make it bad, but always ask if you're using distillers grain if they've done some feed analysis at the plant. Also be cognizant, you might ask about the sulfur level of the distillers grain. In general, cattle can handle about 0.4% sulfur in their total diet. Now, if you get above that, you almost think they're drunk. No, it's not alcohol. That sulfur, higher levels, can affect the brain. So we need to limit the amount of sulfur that they get from distillers grains. Normally, we can't feed all the distillers they want. We're probably banging around 30 to 40%, but that's depending on fat levels and sulfur levels. Some general recommendations as a protein source, it can work quite well, 6 to 15%. As an energy source, based on sulfur and fat level, it can vary. If you are using distillers grain, get a mineral that doesn't have any phosphorus. And there are feed companies that have that accommodate that there's a lot of phosphorus in distillers grain. You can remove, just don't even use a standard mineral. Also with distillers grain, I like to know if the analysis has heat damage protein to it. Heat damage protein is protein that obviously has been cooked too much. And we say distillers grains has high bypass protein. It does. However, the stuff that's burnt to death, it goes into the manure. So that's not the sort of bypass protein that we're looking for. Corn gluten feed, there's a number of things here, but it's kind of like the same thing with distillers grain. It can have high sulfur levels, so we need to look at that. and be cognizant of how much we feed of that particular product. But it is a product that we have available to us here in Ohio, and it certainly merits consideration as a possibility when we're feeding cattle. Whole soybeans. Occasionally, bean meal is relatively expensive. Yeah, we can feed whole soybeans. And I don't know that we need to heat it. There's a statement out there. If you're going to feed it to hogs, you need to cook it. The urease enzyme is in there. And there is some data out there suggesting roasted soybeans for dairy cattle can improve milk production to some degree. We don't have that same data that supports that necessarily in beef cattle, but treat it like a protein supplement. You don't want to overfeed it. Same thing with the fat, the oil. If you feed too much of that, it kind of greases them up, and you don't want to stand behind those cattle when they cough. So use it as a protein supplement. Another fine tuning we can do is how protein is used. Protein is digested in two different locations in cattle. One is absorbed in the rumen. That's rumen degradable protein. That's that RDP. And there's numbers there with those arrows over in my lower left-hand corner of the screen. The other place protein is absorbed is call it undegradable or bypass protein. And it's not, the undegradable there is not necessarily, it can't be absorbed, it's not degraded in the rumen. And there on the rumen degradable protein, whole corn, about half of it is digested in the rumen, rolled corn about 41, distillers grain only 32. So here we come back to distillers grain, it has that bypass protein that you hear about. Soybean meal, most of it is digested or absorbed in the rumen. And urea, it's 100%, none of that. Urea is kind of nitrogen and it's going to be utilized in the rumen. But we can look at this as fine tuning some diets to optimize efficiency. Although I don't want to say it's a religious thing with rumen degradable protein. Back to those professional nutritionists, the question was asked to them, do you use rumen degradable protein in your analysis and diets? 62% of the respondents said that's not one of their decision-making tools. So it's not a wonder drug or a wonder technique for some of these folks. Now, part of that is they could be using urea on a regular basis. So they're already meeting the requirements there. Back up here, urea being 100% rumen degradable. So they're not trying to, they may be getting that without trying. In general, if working with somebody trying to fine tune protein digestion in a feedlot, maybe about 8%. If the diet is 12, let's say 12% crude protein in the ration, you probably want that split into about 8% of that number going into the rumen. We're feeding the rumen bugs. That's why we want a certain amount of protein that can be digested in the rumen. We don't want to starve those bugs because they're eating grain, they're doing some other things there. So make sure you have enough of that. Well, I mentioned urea, non-protein nitrogen. Rumens can do this. We can't. Taking a string of carbons and shoving a piece of nitrogen on it and making it into a protein. It can be cost effective. We'll see here in a moment. To be honest, urea is unfortunately rather expensive right now as well, but it's something we should consider when we're looking at feedlot diets is can we incorporate some non-protein nitrogen into them? I'll briefly mention there are computer tools out there that we can take those numbers from those feeds and plug them in, and you can put in feed prices. One that I use is called Taurus, and we can plug in different feed prices and create a ration. But we can also, what it does, the feeds that aren't used, it gives you prices for them. That's least cost ration balancing. I happen to have a program called Taurus. It's now on Al's computer. I'm sure I can get it to Garth, but if there's some individuals here that are kind of interested in nutrition, that's one you can look at. Another one you can look at is Brands, BRANDS, out of Iowa State. That's probably the most up-to-date one. It costs around $60, the farmer version. So those are some options to consider. If you want to price out some feeds, you can talk to a feed representative or somebody like me, and we can do some price comparisons on different feeds that you have available to you. What are some of the additives that we can use? And I put this one up here. One of my favorite candies has a GMO in it. And they mention it there right at the bottom. Years ago, I'm not going to show you all the data, anything like that, but these feed additives, ionophores like Bovatec, Catalyst, Rumensin, will improve feed efficiency by 4 to 10%. Certainly, working with some feed representatives, you might consider incorporating something like this to improve feed efficiency of your cattle. And it can improve overall feed efficiency. There's Optiflex here, the last 28 days can improve carcass weights as well. Admittedly here, if you're in some special market, I was working with some people today, once again, that were some special market, they're going to have discussions about these products and where they might or might not fit with them. But here's the feed label for Optiflex, but it can increase rate of gain and feed efficiency, and you feed it the last 28 to 42 days. Maybe with the more expensive feeds that we have available to us, we might have to think about looking at some of these products to optimize use of the feeds that we have. What about direct fed microbials? And I'm relying on some research studies right here. This one's out of Kentucky. What all those words say is the direct fed products show real promise in times of stress. Certainly, if we're getting cattle started on feed, something like that, it's not uncommon for these products to be used. I kept on looking for data on feeding it throughout the feeding period. That's not necessarily there in beef cattle. Now, they have done it with dairy cattle feeding product and found some improvement in dairy production, but included direct feds throughout the feeding period. Not necessarily has that been a definitive strategy to use. Implants, not going to beat this to death, but there's things that can go wrong. They can do wonderful things. Improve gain 5 to 15%, improve feed efficiency 5 to 10%. Once again, you may have to think about your market that you're going into for marketing purposes, but this is data that's out there, been proven that implants from a performance standpoint can have an impact. And if you do an implant program, if you know or think when the cattle are going to be marketed, that's where you start planning your implant program, not the day they arrive, where you think the day they think they're going to finish. And then you figure out your implant strategy based on the potency and duration of different implants. I'm really not focusing on that. This is where I want to focus. If we're going to use implants, we want to optimize their use. If we have dirty practices, we are hurting the ability of the implants to have an impact. In one study, average daily gain was decreased about 9%, and feed efficiency decreased another about 8% because of abscesses that they were put in the ear, dirty conditions, and an abscess was formed, and the implant was not as effective. And here's a study of 7 feedlots, 14 different groups of cattle, and looking at what, some of those mistakes that can be made, and abscesses being the major one. So we have to use sanitary practices when we're implanting. This is not about speed. Some people, I know there's people definitely faster than me implanting cattle, but it's really not about speed. It's about sanitation. The pictures you see there of an implant that hasn't caused an infection versus one that has, causing a great big pus around that particular ear. So you'd use a scrape brush, disinfect. Ear clean and dry when we do it. If the ear is dirty, let's clean it up. Scrape it with, say, a dull steak knife, brush the ear with disinfectant, and maybe even coat the implanting needle with an improved antibiotic between animals, maybe working with your veterinarian. And then certainly just use sanitary practices. It could well be somebody else is going to have to really work the cattle. The person implanting the cattle needs to keep their hands clean. You visually inspect that implant after you've done it, and they want you to press where that implant went in down with your glove or hand. That glove or hand probably shouldn't be dirty because that's another introduction of dirt into that area, and then it's infected, and then they just push the implants out. So sanitation is the important part of optimizing these sorts of implants. And look at the label. Here's just one implant on storage. Probably not the dash of the pickup is the place to keep that. So even with certainly beef quality assurance, we talk about keeping modified live products in the refrigerator cool, that sort of thing. But implants as well may well have instructions as well that we need to apply. Evaluate certainly your mineral program. I just mentioned phosphorus is one of the most expensive nutrients. We used to feed a lot more than we do now. So critically evaluate that is a very expensive sort of product to feed. So we probably, think about, especially like with Distillers Grains, that thing, sort of thing, maybe removing that. It's amazing how little we actually need of that phosphorus. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Stan to talk about budgets, and I'll stop sharing.
So kind of transition here just real shortly. As Stan pulls his screen up, Stan Smith, Fairfield County Extension. There last fall, a group of us sat down and looked at some of the resources we had available and decided that we were due to revamp some of our enterprise budgets, if you will. We used to have about 6 different enterprise budgets for fed cattle, steers, heifers, backgrounded, not backgrounded. And we kind of took a different approach, looking more at feeding and managing systems. So Stan's going to walk us through that, maybe some of the differences between the two and how to use them. Stan?
Thanks, Garth. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with folks this evening. As Garth said, we looked at the budgets here a little bit ago, and when you see some of the default prices that are in there, you'll see exactly how long ago it was. But we think we put together a budget tool that you can use effectively, but it all boils down to you having records to plug into them. And I'll show you here in just a minute. Let's look at how to find our tool. All you need to do is remember beef.osu.edu. Start there at that web address, and basically everything that we do as a beef team is located there, including our weekly newsletter and our schedule of events and what have you. So go to beef.osu.edu. You'll get something that looks like this. Across the top, you'll see that the library link is up there. You click on the library link. That'll take you to our resource library, and near the top under economics, you'll find enterprise budgets. And if you click on those enterprise budgets, you'll not only get the beef budgets, but you'll get all the budgets that we do at OSU Extension. And these were updated in 2021, so you can scroll down and take a peek at those. We've got 2 different market beef budgets that we've got roughed out for you. One is a self-fed, basically steer stuffer budget, and the other one is a bunk fed budget. And I'll show you the differences, and then we'll just take a minute and navigate through them a little bit. Starting with the bunk fed budget. For all intents and purposes, the yellow cells are ones that we would expect that you might want to change or adjust. We added a box at the top where you can plug in your starting weight, your estimated finish weight, and kind of unique or new and different is if you've got records that will show you what your average feed per pound of gain is, you can plug that in and it will update it. And we can also plug in an estimated daily gain. Basically what that will do is take the finish weight, deduct the beginning weight from it, take those days, divide by the estimated daily gain, and it will look at how many days are on feed, how much, which is down here. And from there, we can make adjustments to any of these other cells and update things. The blue cells can be overridden, but probably less frequently. We would expect you to do that. We've got it designed so that you can go in and plug in a bunch of different feedstuffs. This isn't designed to be a ration building tool, but it was designed so that you can take what you're actually feeding and plug in. If you've got different moistures, you can change moistures. If you've got another feed that's not identified, you could plug it in here. Dry distillers grain, wet distillers grain, plug in the moisture, plug in how many pounds per head per day you're going to feed for the entire feeding period, all 219 days, plug in a price, and it will plug it into the results over here. Down here, give you an opportunity to plug in a purchase price. Probably too cheap right now. As I said, you'll see how long ago we did these. It was probably last spring, a year ago. Got a chance to plug in how much bedding you're using. I don't know how heavily you're bedding, and I don't know what you're using. It really doesn't matter. But again, it boils down to the records that you're keeping and the ability to plug those things in. If you're borrowing money, you can plug in an interest rate there, and it will take those costs that are put together above. It'll automatically give you a labor charge. If you're into paying yourself a management charge, you can do that. The thing we struggle the most with, quite frankly, are the machinery and building charges. And the backbone for them are in this other tab if you want to look at them. What we would hope is that you would have better records than what we have. We're working on updating those as time permits. But the reality is those are a guess based on some buildings that somebody might have had. So we're going to try to clean those up as time progresses. But quite frankly, if you know what your machinery costs affiliated with your beef cattle enterprise are, and you can split it down on the number of head that are fed, you can override that number here. Same way with the building charge. It might be an old building that doesn't cost you a lot of money, but maybe there's some repairs and maintenance. So again, if you've got the records, there's a place for you to plug it in here. And then we get down to the bottom, returns over variable costs, total costs, which would include some of these fixed costs, and then return to labor and management. This was, again, I want to show you and call your attention. This is a bunk fed, daily bunk feeding. Steve talked early on about bunk scoring, the different efficiencies that are available. This is where, depending on how efficient you are with your bunk, it's going to impact your feed conversion as well as your average daily gain. But let me pull up the steer stuffer budget. For all intents and purposes, that's what it is. And we've got a different default number in there. We got feed per pound of gain defaulted in there with the same size cattle at 9 pounds per pound of gain. We've got estimated daily gains a little bit less. Steve talked with you, especially early on in his presentation, about all the different things that can impact not only feed efficiency, but daily gains. It's important that you've got records to plug in there to make your estimates. Or if you want to look at cattle that are maybe being fed in more difficult conditions and see how much different gains might hurt you. So anyway, an opportunity to look at a couple different ways to do it. But again, you can override all those numbers estimated daily gains, what have you. The rest of it's the same. Corn price is not accurate anymore, so obviously needs to be updated. For around here, we'd probably be looking at something like that. Sale price on the animal is not accurate anymore. We've seen a lot more opportunity there recently. This probably needs to be, if we're selling them today, something closer to that. But again, an opportunity for you folks to take your numbers and do some speculating based on what you can get, and scroll down to the bottom and do some comparisons. So we'd invite you to take a look at that whenever you can, and plug in your own numbers. That's what's most important.
All right, I think we'll get ready to shift gears here a little bit. You know, as you can see on the screen, the title of the next presentation is one that I think generated a lot of questions as we look at what COVID has done, you know, directly or indirectly, however it may be, to the beef industry. So with us tonight, we have Dr. Lyda Garcia, Extension Meat and Science Specialist. They're on campus, Department of Animal Science. She's going to talk to us about that for the majority of her presentation, then maybe shift gears and talk about some findings they found from a project here in our local Ohio meat processor. Lyda.
Good evening. That's all you got. I drove all the way over here to see you guys. Excited to leave my office, right? As Garth was speaking earlier, I was thinking, I just saw Garth roughly about what noon. We had harvested hogs and lambs today. I was looking sexy, let me tell you that. Thank goodness I had time to go home and shower. So no, really excited to be here. See some familiar faces, which is always good. You brought your friends, so even better. So you know, this particular topic is still a hot topic today. 2 years right into the pandemic. How sad is that? We're still in the pandemic. It's re-recorded, right? So it's going to be a sudden pause. But for those of you who don't know me, I've been here at Ohio State for 6.5 years. Feels like almost just yesterday I arrived. I hail from Texas. All my schooling's in Texas. Dad was a Texas cowboy who had a 3rd grade level education. Mom was a public school teacher who had a master's. So I grew up with the both ends of the spectrum. However, I'll tell you, my father had a PhD in life, if you understand what I'm saying. And that is what has helped me today the most. Nothing against the education of the masters and so forth, but the pandemic, even today, I wish my father was still alive, because I was doing animal processing on farm to help those counties, communities who were needing to take matters into their own hands. I cringe to think of improper practices. Our clientele, like this young girl right here, scared me to even think about her consuming product that was done on farm and wasn't done properly. So I kicked it into gear, started showing up, inviting myself. I'll do that. Just welcome me, and we'll go through the whole process, right? This COVID thing is job security for me, just to let y'all know. So glad y'all had me. So I do hold a 50% teaching appointment, 50% extension and outreach. I'm also deemed as the extension meat specialist for the state of Ohio. Now we do have 2. We're very blessed to have 2 extension meat specialists. I am on the fresh meats. I do more on the production side. I do more of the packing plant equipment, designing, whatever you want to call it, to cuts, sensory evaluation, you name it. My colleague Lynn Knight does more of what I say the important stuff, is more on the food safety and HACCP. So since the inception of COVID, you know, we've been working together on this. So what I want to do first is just give you an overview of our meat system. It's complex. I didn't appreciate how the media downplayed a lot of things of our industry and only highlighted the negative. Yeah, some things happen. Yeah, you're dealing with people, right? When there are people around, you can expect error, absolutely. But this is the best figure that I could put together for you to show you all the different pathways products, meat products from one animal can go. Slaughter live animals and look at, but at the end of the day, it's all about the consumers, right? So how it starts? Well, let's start with the ante-mortem. We have our trucks that show up. They unload. They go into the holding pens. Mixed. You see them all different colors. We have inspection that are up on the cat or inspectors, I'm sorry, doing ante-mortem inspection, making sure that these animals are ambulatory. What do I mean by that? They're able to walk on their own. They look healthy. They're not balking just to balk because they're in pain, right? This is where that ante-mortem inspection happens. Now, they will also evaluate unloading. That's part of the animal handling. They go into the chutes. Now, of course, this is a Holstein. I just took this not too long ago at a cow bull plant. Then they are stunned using a captive bolt. That's one of the approved methods of stunning. Once they're stunned and they're stuck, meaning we have severed the carotid artery and jugular vein to drain. Understand this, death doesn't occur until the heart stops. I have to make that very clear. That was a challenge that I was having, not just in Ohio, but other places that I was being invited to come and talk about this stuff. Remember that death occurs when the heart stops. Then we start with the opening of the hide. Now, understand that internally, that carcass is sterile. The hide protects everything, doesn't it? Just like us, our skin. Once we start opening the hide, then naturally these intervention steps come into play to try to reduce, eliminate any potential cross-contamination. So we start with the hind leg transfer. Then eventually we run to the hide puller. This is a machine that'll open it up this way and eventually it'll just pull it down. Now I was afraid that we would have mixed company tonight. So that's why I'm just going to give you the brief overview. Okay, because I want her to stay in our world. I want to see her all. And then it goes to the viscera table. They're eviscerated, the viscera, and then the carcasses are split. This right here, the splitting job is the highest paid job on that slaughter floor. It makes sense. If you go over one side versus the other, you're stealing from Peter to give to Paul. And Peter only needs so much to make it, right? So then eventually, now this is just one picture, but the carcass will go through a carcass wash. High pressure nozzles, aiming about, not aiming, angled at about 45 degrees from top to bottom, roughly about a good 12 feet, right? And you have nozzles every, I would say every 5-6 inches apart and shooting cold water downwards, because with gravity at play, you want everything to run down. You don't want to go against gravity. Then it'll go through a trimming process where employees and inspectors will evaluate carcasses from top to bottom, meaning from hind shank all the way to fore shank, and they'll trim whatever needs to be removed. Once all that is done, then a 2 to 2.5% lactic acid is applied. That's the last step, the last intervention step for food safety. Okay. They're rolled into what we call a hot box, which is in the middle. The box isn't hot. The reason why it's called the hot box is because the carcasses are hot. The temperature in that hot box is roughly 35 to 38 degrees with jet fans blowing everywhere. Our frocks are always flaring up like Marilyn Monroe. Remember that image? Yeah, that's when we can walk through that hot box with, because that's how strong the fans are. The picture on top is our cow carcasses, cold cows. Picture at the bottom are fed beef. Why I say that is because one whole rail, and I mean from one end of the box to the other, will hold 100 sides. With cold cows, it's going to be a little bit more. And why? Because the conformation of a cold cow isn't always as nice and meaty as a fed beef carcass, right? So, but, and I tell you that to kind of put numbers down on the table for you. If one rail can hold 100 sides and one box holds or has or offers or whatever you want to call it, about 20 rails, do the math. And then, oh, by the way, you have 5 other boxes. That makes sense? That's a lot of carcasses that come and go. Now, the cooler, this is where rigor mortis happens. Rigor mortis is the point where muscle becomes weak. The live animal is muscle. There's still oxygen running through. When rigor mortis happens, that's now that energy is no longer present. Now you have stiffness, right? The muscle, you can't move that foreshank. Now we have meat. Now this is where it all begins. Then once after roughly about 36 to 48 hours, now I'm talking about large scale packing plants. We're not talking about small scale, like small or very small. That's a little different. But 36 to 48 hours later, then they go over to the grade chain or the grade stand. And that's where our graders will grade and assess a dollar value based on quality grade and yield, right? Quality grade based on the estimated consumer eating experience and estimated percent sellable product. And that's where the grid comes into play for a place when it comes to dollar value. Then once everything is graded, then they go into what we call the jungle. So if you envision, let's say every other line, at least this going this way, if you envision all the carcasses, let's say that were choice heavyweights, would all go here. So that could be choice, yield grade 4s and 5s are all grouped together, right? And then let's say further down, this rail is a select lightweights. So selects, let's say yield grade 1s and 2s. So remember the holding pens that you saw with all the different colors? Yeah, that's a heterogeneous group. They're all mixed. Grading actually sorts them to where they're more similar, homogeneous. And that's where the jungle comes into play. And I'll tell you, our Buckeyes are very fortunate to be on meat judging teams, to be able to go into these plants and get tours and then practice. Because these are my Buckeyes at the plant at Tyson up in Johnson, Illinois. And I should advise this young girl here, never say never. I vow that I'd never step into a plant again after I finish my doctorate at Texas A&M. And every time I go in and I'm with my Buckeyes, I just shake my head and say never say never, right? So be smarter than me, don't say that. Then from there, the cooler, then now that's when it goes into fabrication. There are roughly on average, if you notice, their tables going this way, more horizontal. Those tables are all responsible for certain parts, certain meat cuts. Every employee is responsible for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 steps of that product. So in other words, the conveyor belt's roughly running about 2 to 3 miles per hour, depends if it's on A shift or B shift. And let's say that my job on the rib table, which we're going to run ribeye rolls for prime rib, my job is to grab that ribeye roll, look for that connective tissue, that yellow elastic connective tissue that we see sometimes, make sure it's off, and I have to make sure my tail is no more than 2 inches in length. And then I throw it back. 2 go by, I grab that next one, right? Each employee has their job, their task. There, in this picture, this is a beef, this was taken at a beef plant. You can see that they're roughly maybe a foot away. If it's poultry, a smaller species, they're going to be a little closer, right? We're looking at roughly about 200 to 300 employees just in the fabrication room. And on the slaughter floor, we're looking at roughly about 100, 125, depends on the size, but you get the numbers. In the cooler, not counting the grader, we have cooler superintendents, we have sales guys there, we have trainees there, we have whomever, there's roughly about 30 people there, okay? You have hourly employees also moving carcasses. If there's not an automated chain mover or carcass mover, you have people literally manually pushing carcasses so that they're all able to fill the orders in that fabric. So the big question here is what happened? Well, you guys have a gist of what happened. When that virus first showed up, no one really knew anything about it. What's the flu? What's something, this DNA was completely new. And what happens as human beings when something surfaces and we don't know anything about it? We scramble, make a lot of errors. I do at least because I don't understand it enough. But with time and through trial and error, we learn more. And it's unfortunate that sometimes it's at the sacrifice of someone else. This is what happened in the meat packing. All these plants, something suddenly showed up and everybody's like, what in the world are we dealing with here? And that's when the media took care of some things for us. Inability to follow social distancing. How many of you followed the rules when they told you you had to wear a mask? What do you think these people said trying to work and all they want to do is get a paycheck? And you're going to tell me I have to social distance and now I can't go over there? They said it English, Spanish, and about 8 different languages, I bet. Common transportation from and to work. And it's not just the undocumented. There's roughly, we estimate 33% of the employees in large scales to be undocumented, right? Or from a different country. Yeah, it makes sense that they would carpool. Yeah, but you know what? So do the Americans. I've seen it firsthand. Therefore, infected workers that cause the spread at community level. Yeah, that makes sense, of course. What do we do Super Bowl? I mean, look at this gig over here. I walked in and I was like, oh, yeah, it's that kind of meeting, right? I got it. Look at him. Look at him. Done. So this eventually, as it snowballed, eventually it led to a big loss in production. In some cases 25, but in some cases to 43. On average, these large-scale packing plants are harvesting 6,200 head a year. 43% of that, that's a big loss there, a big cut. Large-scale packing plants. And then I'm talking about your top 3, not 4, 3 beef players. Cargill, Tyson, JBS. These chains, back when I was working on my master's at West Texas A&M University, and I was working for the Beef Carcass Research Center to collect beef carcass data for the government, research, ranchers, whoever needed data. We traveled nationwide. And the chain per hour was running about 275 head an hour. Today, we're at 380, 400 an hour. And I only know this because we were just at Tyson in November. That's a lot. So what happened here? Well, the prices increased obviously due to less production, which then led to an increase, demand increase by us, right? Because of, we panicked. It took me a little while to grasp that. Less production, we demanded more, so we paid more. That hurts, doesn't it? And we saw it, and we're still seeing it today. We really are. So here's what we saw. At the very beginning, now plants started shutting down roughly in March. Restaurants and spending of restaurants and hotels significantly dropped. Yeah, it made sense because now the government said can't go out anymore. What did you say?
Hell no.
Oh, that was, sorry. Did you just say that? I would.
I should have on the lighter
Why is that the oven doesn't break on Saturday or Friday night and then work again on Monday?
So why don't you cook?
I had to cook those. And restaurants closed because of profit.
And you're a better man because of that, aren't you? Okay.
That's my story. I'm sticking to it.
So now we have a national emergency declared on March 13th. Sometimes I think back to this time and think how just a whirlwind happened. And me in my position, I didn't really quite, I mean, I knew what was happening, but I couldn't grasp fast enough when it came to our Ohio meat processors and how and how to help it. Now, this is something that not everybody knows. The media didn't report this. Did you know that there are studies, and this one comes from London, that the virus grows faster under cold environments? What temperature did I tell you the cooler was in? Or the hot box? What I didn't tell you about the fab room was that it ranges about the same as well. Because the pathogens and the bacteria that we have to work with and account for in meat, or whether it's beef, pork, lamb, goat, poultry, there's a reason why we keep things cold. It slows down that growth. But now studies are telling us that this virus proliferates under cold temperatures, and it loves metallic surfaces. Stainless steel. What do you think is made up all the equipment in our packing plants? We got 2 strikes against us right here already. When I learned this, I shook my head and I said, I don't even know if I want to tell. It's depressing. It's truly depressing. So now, what I want to talk about now is, okay, here we are at the packing plant. This packing plant's mission is just to make money. Let's be honest. What do we need to do to keep running? Obviously can't afford to shut down. We can slow our operations. Rather than have about 125 on that slaughter floor, we now have about 50. Remember I said that chain speed was running today about 400, 415 an hour, dropped to about maybe 175 an hour. That hurts, doesn't it? Talk about prices, we talk about, so the one thing that the meat industry did realize is that they had to take care of their employees, because at the beginning, you saw a lot of things on so many documentaries about these plants not taking care of their employees. And I came out in one of them, an ABC News something meat chain supply. I didn't know any of the others who they had interviewed. And it was very interesting because ABC put an employee worker who was at a Cargill plant right after me, when I said, because at that point when I gave the interview, I said, these packing plant companies understand the value of their employees. They have to take care of them in order to make money. Did I lie? The God honest truth. So my whole point was, they're going to do everything they can to keep them safe. And then not even seconds later, they had this woman who worked at Cargill on the phone and said, they didn't take care of me. I got sick and I lost, I don't even know who she lost, family, friends. They didn't care. They just told us to get to work. Put your high dollar, my South Texas Brahmin side. Reason why is because they staged it. Because when that woman spoke, she was talking about the beginning. Remember how I said at the beginning, we panic. We don't know what to do when something new comes up and we know nothing about it. And here I am in August of 2020, giving now this interview. Oh, I called ABC, by the way. And I said, don't ever call me back. You tell the story right. At least they could have said at the beginning and then have me, but no, you know, juiciness sells, right? Unless he's cooking, there's no juice in that one. All right, so what were the objectives for the meat industry, okay, for them? Worker safety and efficiency, because remember, these large-scale packing plants are built for efficiency. We can't say that for our smaller packing plants, but it is for our larger packing plants. When it came to April, now the yellow line are actually the meat packing plant workers, the red are us, US cases. We hit our peak latter part of April, early May, which was extremely alarming for all our packing plants in the United States. This is what actually, let me go back to this one. This is what they categorized it into 2 groups. One was more engineering. Now, what do we do in plant to try to reduce any type of cross-contamination? Then it came to the administrative side. Now, this is the part, the administrative side was the most difficult piece to have them control. And tell me what is challenging about that side? Carpooling. How do you do that? How do you encourage? Because a lot of us said, I'm not staying home. I'm gonna go out and see so-and-so, and we're gonna start the fire, and we're gonna fight the pit, and whatever it is. Yeah, that's what was happening. So one thing I have to make clear is the white frock, the apron, which is also like a plastic rubber apron, the arm guard, the mesh glove, the earphones or earplugs, hard hat. Let me see. What else am I looking here? But you don't see your rubber boots that are steel-toed as well. Those are all PPEs in place pre-COVID. The mask was an option. And tell me, who in the world's going to wear a mask if they don't have to? That was already there. And I'll tell you, as an undergraduate student, as a master's student, and as a PhD student who lived in these factory plants, the only group that I ever saw wear masks were the employees from Michigan. Nobody else did. So I'm here to tell you the masks have always been there. They're just optional. Now it's mandatory, right? They now have added the shield guards or the face shield, I'm sorry. That's always been an option too. But you don't have to wear one. What? Wear one. But they've been there this whole time. So they added the partitions, you know, this one happens to be of clear plastic. They created more distance between the employees. Now, so here we are at a bacon plant. They added partitions as well. They even got creative. And again, this was to encourage social distancing. It wasn't to eliminate any airborne particles. I have to make that clear. They got these plants called in maintenance, and maintenance had to use their creativity and used a lot of PVC pipe in these plants to try, because they had to figure it out fast. Partitions in the cafeterias, just as well. They added tents outside, and thank goodness this happened during more of the summertime than the winter. I don't know how this would have worked in the winter. I don't know what, I have not seen any any tents at these packing plants. What I have seen is that they have now added more shifts, more rotations to their shifts. The cleanup crew has always been there. There are usually 3 shifts. You have first shift is more experienced, B shift are the new hires, C shift is the cleanup crew. Usually starts at about 10:18 p.m. and runs to about 4:36 a.m. That's the cleanup crew. The only difference here that I'm noticing is the mask. Everything else has been there. Oh, and by the way, all these disinfectants that they use pre-COVID, if you go to the EPA website, Environmental Protective Agency, look up list of approved disinfectants for bacteria, pathogens, molds, viruses. Guess what was already on there pre-COVID? Coronavirus. That's already been accounted for. The media sure hell didn't tell you that part, did they? So what they did now is, okay, so because they already knew their disinfectants tackled coronavirus and all these other viruses, all they did was now add 2 more sanitation times per shift. But I mentioned that they already use hot water that ranges between 160 degrees Fahrenheit to about 180 degrees. That's hot. And high pressure, that's hot. They also created one-way directions. Usually it's a 2-way or it's mixed. It's just a madhouse in these packing plants. Now they had only one direction, one way always. And then they rerouted, or they knocked down walls to create another pathway to get to wherever they needed to go. They also began hiring people, just hourly employees, just to wipe down contact surfaces, such as handles, going into the men and women locker rooms to wipe down during their operations. New employees were hired. So Then they started to offer more incentives. Okay. So if you stay and work for me, I'll give you $500 this week. Because it was a week by week basis. Period. Now there are bonuses every year. If you stay working up to a certain point, you get a bonus, and that can range. When we were at Tyson in Joslin, Illinois in November, preparing for the International Meat Judging Contest, that particular day, Tyson was offering ribeye meals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for those who have been vaccinated, not boosted, with the second vaccine. And 88% of their employees had already received the second vaccine. Oh, and it was all over the place in that packing plant. So let's go back to this now. We know that this was our peak, right? Now we started to add all these interventions. But then we got another peak here, July. What do you think happened here? What's that?
4th of July.
4th of July. And what do we do 4th of July?
Party, right?
What did he say? What did he say?
All those germs, so, I mean, I have this in there, couldn't get sick between about 18 and 24, what alcohol content was.
Saying anything. Well, what happened here in September? Labor Day. What happened there? Yeah, there's a common trend here, and just like now, right? We come together and we run the risk, COVID or not COVID. That's just common. That's just fundamental. So where are we now in the sense of what started to lead to today? Well, believe it or not, obviously we talked about the infrastructure already. The vaccine became a priority for some. It started with Tyson. All you needed at the time was just the vaccine. A lot of their employees were then leaving Tyson to go to Cargill because Cargill wasn't requiring it yet. And that stinks because if you're in the Texas panhandle, you just do a triangle up at Cactus, Texas, you have JBS Swift beef. And then roughly about 2.5 hours southwest, you have Cargill and Freona, Texas. And then if you go roughly about an hour and 15 minutes northeast, now you're in Amarillo, Texas with Tyson. You have 3, all within a 2.5 hour radius. So these employees at Tyson and Amarillo were saying, I'm out. I'm going to go to Freona, Texas to go work for Cargill, or I'm going to go up to JBS. And it was a game. It was a true game. The CDC did mandate the mask again, because there for a while they got lax, and then they brought it back. Then, if for packing plants who were USDA inspected, we federally inspected, the inspectors had to wear a mask to protect themselves, according to USDA. Oh yeah, and then by the way, eventually the companies, the businesses that were requesting this type of inspection, federal inspection, then USDA came in and said, well, if you're gonna want our employees here, all your employees are gonna have to wear a mask. Caused a lot of problems, let me tell you that. Then the company vaccines even started to take off. Cargill was the first one. Right now, JBS, and I'm working with JBS right now because I need to get into their plants. We now not only need our vaccine, we need the booster, and we need to have a negative test 72 hours before arrival. That's the part that I'm trying to work with. And so, okay, so that's in general, right? It started to hit 95 to 100% capacity. And then guess who showed up? The Omicron. What do you think happened? Slowed it all the way back down. Now, luckily there wasn't that big of a, it didn't make the news as big as the first time, but yeah, now we're back to square one on some level. Here we are fighting for the vaccine and saying, meaning you have to get it, and now a new one shows up. And the way it works is that DNA is constantly changing. And if you get any virus, it's a vaccine, it doesn't matter what it is, you're only accounting for that DNA, not accounting for this. Now it's like, now what?
I said that's the first time they announced it.
What's that?
They should account for more strain for the virus.
Well, in all fairness, the new strains hadn't come out yet because it was brand new.
Right, but coronavirus wasn't new. It's just new in people.
People, that's right. Very similar to the bat, but we're not gonna get into that. There's no crown roll feature out there.
Probably back.
So now, here we are, meat judging, right? I take my students to these packing plants. We got to experience those partitions, and let me tell you, I personally didn't like it. I personally, we were sitting next to each other, all close, and in that picture, I mean, as funny as Brittany was trying to be, she was saying something, and I said, "What are you saying?" And she turned and said, "Are you not listening to me?" And I said, "I literally can't hear every word you're saying." And she was speaking normal. That is the cafeteria in Sioux City, Tyson, for the International Meat Judging Contest. Even then, our judges had to sit in partitions. That was probably the first time it had really hit me, right, of what it's like to have to be in this scenario. So PPEs are enforced, no doubt. Sanitizers left and right, everywhere you go, there's a sanitizer. Foot baths have become even more popular. They still have challenges. Part of it may be the vaccine, maybe, but I also say this is not a very sexy line of work. It's labor intensive. And if you haven't already figured out, the younger generation's it's not too keen on manual labor. They're smarter though, and on a different level, right? But for the most part, it's hard to get them to want. Just this morning at our harvest floor, we start at 6 a.m. Garth can probably attest to this. He worked at the meat lab. Our students didn't want to get up. So now our meat lab hours have shifted. 6:30, 7 o'clock, and I'm there at 5:45 ready. And they're like, "No, we're going to start at 6:30. Why? Oh, because so-and-so said they could only be." Even our own meat lab, we have to, it's like we're forced to have to work with them. So when it comes to Ohio, right, but that's just large scale. When it comes to Ohio, what I'm having to do right now is, not now, I take it back, it was usually because there was so much pressure on the smaller meat processors to take so many livestock that they didn't normally take, is that you're not comparing apples to apples. And as I sit with people and we're sitting at the table and we're designing their holding pens, we're designing the kill floor, designing the fat room, offal, cook, whatever it is, I have to remind them, you're not large scale. Make sure whatever you're doing is going to work. And it's as efficient as it could possibly be, but that will set you up to exist 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now. And we're not focused on this. And this is what I try to help them with, because, and I get it, it's understandable. They're comparing to the large scale on some level. So we're still having trouble with labor. I did offer a 2-day meat cutting workshop. That was a Band-Aid. I'll be the first to tell you. I just needed to be proactive. But I didn't get very many people attending who wanted to go into meat processing. The people that attended my workshops were more from the culinary arts, agri-science teachers who were teaching meat science, meat judging, retail cuts. I had those from the Grocers Association for the grocery stores, and for those who were left to have that offer a meat department. And then I had just typical civilians downtown who just wanted to learn. And when I have spoken to the Ohio Department of Agriculture and others, I say, your land grant institution will do everything they can to help. So you have to come to grips with something. We can offer all the program in the world, all the education, you name it. But if nobody wants to work, that's a different ballgame. And that's what I'm still working on today, is the workforce development piece. So workforce development, we have a national shortage of inspectors as well, nationally and state level, I'm working with ODA to try to somehow maybe to get the governor's office to uplift the freeze, the hiring freeze with ODA. Not easy. We're short graders. I'm trying to tip out my students to do internships with USDA Agricultural Marketing Service to try to get them to want to go into grading. And so when we compare just the overall system of both plants, the smaller, mid-size, it's a bit more simple, but that doesn't mean that their challenges aren't as big. So here are just some pictures of some things that I've taken. Now this one I stole from the internet, so I don't know who she is, but the whole point is that she's to represent inspection. Yeah. All right, so because of the meat processing issue that we had, there for a hot minute, I was looking into possibly helping the state of Ohio offer premiums for cattle that were being sold to these meat processors and put into the meat case. I was working with Ben Brown, who we lost to Missouri, in trying to figure out how can we add premium to our cattle that we know are breeding great. You'll grade 2s, 3s, choice, maybe prime, because there is a difference when you're going off a grid versus not, right? So before we got into deep, Ben and I said, well, first of all, we have to capture what we're producing. And that's what started with this, my master's students who just graduated. We did an Ohio meat quality audit as best as we could for the first time at the state level. Well, I take it back, Kentucky found out that I was doing this because I was talking to him and he was drinking his bourbon, I was drinking my crown on this side, and it spilled. So now they're doing it as well. We're still friends, by the way. So what we did here, you said don't touch the top and bottom, right? So what we did was when I realized what was happening and what we wanted to do, I reached out to the Ohio Beef Council and I said, I have an idea. I'd like to do the beef quality audit to try to just take a snapshot of what we're producing. So we collected from February 2021 to September. I wanted to account for some cold days and some hot days, just to see if there were any differences. Perfect. Thank you very much. So here's how we broke up the state of Ohio. Now, we audited 15 processors. Not because we chose 15, we actually had 45 on our list. These were the only 15 who allowed us to come in. And the only reason we weren't allowed in other plants is because they were so swamped, they thought we were going to come in and hinder them. I didn't fight them, I just said not a problem. So of the 45, 15 let us in, broke it up into 4 areas as best as possible to represent different regions of Ohio. And we audited them twice. So one in the February, March, April time when it was cold, and then we did July, August, and September to account for the heat. We looked at basic carcass characteristics. We ribbed them to the 12th and 13th rib. We allowed about a 20-minute moon time, meaning we allowed that meat or that ribeye to change from a dark red to a bright cherry red. That's for oxygenation. And then we measured back fat, ribeye size, kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. We accounted for hot carcass weight. Then we looked at quality grades, marbling, color, skeletal maturity, lean maturity. We also looked at sex too, heifers, steers versus bulls, cows. We also looked at external fat color. We looked at bruises, quality defects known as dark cutters, calluses, blood splashes,
Trying to think if there's anything else. So this is just to give you an idea of where we measured 3/4 of that ribeye. We used a ribeye dot grid that measured in square inches. Every 10 dots was 1 square inch. And then we used a USDA marbling cards. That's our gold standard when it comes to evaluating marbling, degrees of marbling. This was the fat color that we put together. Now, the American Meat Science Association already had that description, but they had no pictures to go with it. So we created our own. We matched our colors to that. So this was our scale that we used, 1 to 5. Then, when we looked at the overall average, the overall arithmetic means, we found that the yield grade 1 being the best, meaning the trimmest, heaviest muscle, yield grade 5 being the lightest muscle, excessive fat. On average, out of 774 carcasses that we evaluated, we averaged a yield grade 2. Pretty darn good, is what that's saying. When we looked at quality grade, we averaged a select, which is a select with a range between 3 to 3.9% intramuscular fat. But that's not what I want you to focus on. What we need to focus on is, should I break it down? There it is. The marbling here. That 400 series is actually a low choice. The way quality grade works is we have to account for skeletal maturity, age of animal at time of harvest, and marbling with coloring to give us the overall quality grade. So even though we averaged a low choice, we had a little more carcasses that were a little bit more advanced in age that dropped that quality grade. Okay. When it came to ribeye size, 12.9, that's pretty good. We want between an 11 to about a 14. We're in that normal range. If we look at back fat, 4/10. It's not bad. Hot carcass weight, we average 763. Right now, our industry is roughly at about 850, 865. So to give you an idea of back fat ranges, we had some that had no fat. That's just the membrane that we have our ruler on, just a membrane. And then on the far right, we went all the way to a 1.2 inches of back fat. So that was our range for the 774 carcasses. Came to marbling, we had standard, which there's nothing in there. This is a practically void, all the way to a prime. So when we're looking at just the means, comparing it to the national beef quality audit, okay, because this is a national audit, but this is where I got the idea from. If we compare nationally, we are actually a little bit leaner, a little bit heavier muscle when it comes to the overall yield grade. We're a 2, they're a 3. We look at back fat, here it is right here. We look at ribeye size, we're almost a square inch smaller, but we're still in the good range, in the normal range. We looked at marbling, we have produced the same. The main thing to focus on is that 400 number. Don't worry about the 72 or the 70. That's degrees and that's a bit more subjective. But we're still producing the majority of our, what we audited were low choice. And I don't know about you, but that's damn good. This is what I was hoping we would find. Now, NBQA didn't evaluate color. We were on the 2 range. And if you remember what the 2s were, that was a creamy white. Okay. Now we did see it 1 through 5, that I will tell you. If we look at just the percent occurrences, so in other words, within the primes, how many of them were actually prime? Within the choices, how many of them were actually choice? So what the main thing here is that when the primes came up, all the primes stayed in the prime category. And the reason why I say this is because remember how I mentioned earlier, age can have an effect on that quality grade. We can drop it. This is good, is what I'm trying to tell you, is our choices stayed in our choice categories. Where it got pretty sticky was gonna be more in our selects, our standards, because that could have skeletal maturity will have an impact on that. And then others are more commercial cutter counter, things like that, okay? If we compared yield grade to quality grade, how many of our yield grade ones were prime? How many of our yield grade choices, right? This is what we're looking at. Of our yield grade ones, the majority of them, well, 11 to 4, so 14%, 15% of them were choice select or yield grade ones. That's pretty darn good. Yield grade twos, we had roughly 40% within choice and select. Yield grade threes, so forth. Does that make any sense? We really needed to find a correlation, if there was a correlation to this. If we had a yield grade 2 and it was an other, chances are that may have been a full cow. Now, understand that bulls don't grade in the United States. We pulled them out of this data, right? They're not eligible to grade. Yeah. I'm present. So, and if we looked at quality defects, we did look at bruising. Bruising would have been anything from golf ball size to softball, maybe a basketball. We did see one basketball. 6% were bruises, 2 were dark cutters. Dark cutters are due to long-term stress. But understand that stress can be physiological stress, need handling. It could be psychological stress, right? Biology. And then more nutritional stress. So I'm not making any accusations here. I'm just saying this is what we saw. Hardly any calluses or blood splashes. Now, 6% of 774 is pretty good. This is what I need you to know. We did see a problem in bruising. When it came to sexes, they were predominantly steers and then heifers. We did the cold cows too, because we did audit the custom plants as well. We needed to see what the customs were producing. So, and then that was my graduate student who I stole from Texas A&M to do this master's study. And so, Lyda Garcia, forgot to say that. So yeah, so again, going back to my original question was, should we come up with some type of grid system? And I'm using the word grid because that's just the best word to describe what I'm getting at, to create some kind of premium for those of you who are producing that top high quality cattle. I think it was Stan that told me that he gets a little bit of a premium from his processor because his processor knows he's going to do well. Okay, but can we take that premium a little bit higher and then sell it? Because people will buy it. That's one thing that I've learned, especially through COVID, is they'll buy prime, they'll buy choice. So I'm still left with the question, should we come up with some type of grid system for the state? So anyway, so that's just a snapshot of what we found. By no means was this study perfect because it was the first go around and I needed to get it